We hear constantly about threats to American democracy, threats to the rule of law, and rightly so. We're living in a moment when the legitimacy of our governing institutions is constantly being questioned and attacked in different ways on all sides of our politics. But an enormous amount of how these challenges get talked about, really almost the only way that they get talked about, is in what has become a highly partisan parlance of the left. The left's concerns about democracy are by no means unfounded, but I do think that they are incomplete as a description of what should concern the friends of the American regime in this moment. Our aim is by no means to downplay or to dismiss concerns about the recklessness, the dangerous misbehavior of some people in our politics, but it is to broaden the aperture, to see how we've come to a place where that kind of misbehavior is at home in our political culture.
The revolt of 1910 against Joseph Cannon, I think, is the pivotal turning point in Congress's history. Really, we're still living in the shadow of that revolt against the Speaker in 1910. Why is it that these party leaders served a beneficial role? First, they ensured that decisions would not be transferred over to the executive branch. You can almost explain Theodore Roosevelt's presidency through the lens of Joseph Cannon. Cannon constrained Roosevelt, who had very significant designs for expanding presidential power, as people generally know. That every time there's weak leadership in Congress, you get a strong executive, and every time Congress resurges to claim leadership from the executive, it vests power in its leaders, and that leads to a weak president. Henry Clay and Madison would be another illustration of this. The problem is that members of Congress think more about outcomes rather than about process. And so if they get the outcomes that they want through the judiciary, it's not going to cause them to take any sort of a leadership role. They'll just appreciate the outcome. And that seems to work for both sides. It seems to be that both parties, members in Congress, are happy to get the outcomes that they want, even if they're not the ones producing the outcome. And I think this goes back to the question of individual power versus collective power. Members really want to get to the result, even if it's not done collectively through Congress. So until you somehow fix that problem, I don't think the Supreme Court is going to save us or is going to revive Congress. And I think anybody who hopes that the court will do that is going to be sadly disappointed.
The key for so many of these reforms from a systemic level is shifting the determinative election, the one that will decide who the representative is, from the primary election to the general election, and thereby expand the electorate. And again, kind of in theory, and we're still figuring some of this out in practice, as many of the reforms are still getting their feet under them. But the premise then is that the winner is much more representative of the district that they represent. Why could this help Republicans? Well, what we've seen in recent years is a number of Republicans who have to do this dance. You have to run to the right in the primary so that you can get through it, and then you do what's best you can to pivot back to the center in the general if you can. But the Republican grassroots and base voters have come to a point of punishing a lot of Republicans for such behavior and holding them out instead to levels of purity tests that says we need you to be the person you were when you were running here in the primary. And the result of that is Republicans having lost a ton of seats across the country in the last couple of years. You can point to 2020 or 2022 when Republicans put forward really bad candidates in key states. And at this point, you could make real claims, I think, that the control of the Senate and that the House majority would be even bigger for Republicans if the representatives weren't so beholden to their primary voters as the ones who were determining the outcome of the election. I think what's important as part of this conversation is a recognition that there are flaws and there are going to be problems with any of these systems we put forward. We are humans creating human institutions. They're going to come with our human flaws. I think one of the things when I look back at key races where there have been two Democrats or two Republicans running against each other in Washington in particular, very often the more, moderate's not even quite the right word, but just the more pragmatic and relatable to voters that candidate is the one that ended up winning. It may not have been that every Republican picked them, or many Republicans might have sat out or wrote in someone else, but enough of the Republicans or independents who lean Republican did participate and ultimately tilted the election in the direction of that candidate. I don't think that's a bad thing. It means that they're being representative and responsive to their electorate.
So for for those of us who've gone to law school, you're kind of steeped in this for 3 years, and you understand some of the competing schools of thought about the proper roles of judges. But I think a lot of people, and especially the media, has adopted this view that, well, we're all legal realists. Let's just call it what it is. You're just voting based on what your own policy preferences are. I think that's really unfortunate if that is what people think is happening. I also think it's, they call it legal realism. I actually think it's legal pessimism, because that's not what it should be happening. And so even if, in some unfortunate instances that is what happens, we should always be, and judges should be, trying to do better, trying to always look at what the law is and decide what the law says. What does the text say? The reason that the text is supreme is because that is what the elected representatives voted on, and that's what the president signed, and that's why judges have to be bound by it. So when you talk about judges as politicians, or like I said in my remarks, like the idea that the panel had 2 Trump appointees and 1 Obama appointee, I think that gives people a misimpression of what judges are supposed to be doing. There's no question in my mind that the 2 political branches should be pursuing the common good, right? That's what, and as the populace decides what it is, that's what they should be pursuing. Their policies should be about pursuing the common good for the largest amount of people. That's what they should do. The question is, how does that impact judges? How should judges then apply the law? And I think it's dangerous if you want an unelected judge to start deciding what he or she thinks is good. It seems to me that's fundamentally undemocratic. Obviously the criticism is, well, how do you decide? And so I think there's a place for common good constitutionalism, and the place is in the elected branches. That's where it belongs.
There's another extra constitutional role that I think has played some part in the dysfunction of the presidency and does pose a challenge to Republican self-government. This is what Rossiter called the voice of the people role. What you would say would be sort of the centrality of rhetoric to the presidency. You could see it, little flashes of it in the 1800s, but it's really not cemented as a major part of the presidency till the early part of the 20th century. Teddy Roosevelt kind of took a shot at it, but Woodrow Wilson was the one who really formalized it and built a whole theory around it. This, in my view, has opened the door gradually, but I think much farther than anyone would have wanted at this point, to a certain sort of demagoguery emanating from the presidency that you would not have expected, for the most part, in years past. This brings to mind the warning that the founders issued in the Federalist Papers against the possibility of presidential leadership that would be sort of meteors that dazzle as well as mislead. And I think we are more open to that now than in the past. Well, I think certainly the selection system has contributed. I wrote years ago, there are scholars much more accomplished than I who have written about this for a long time, about how we need to move toward a system in which the party has a little bit more control over the candidate rather than the other way around. And ever since I've been studying this for the last 30 years plus, it's been going in the other direction. Yeah. Right? So now, basically, neither party has much of a platform. The platforms used to be quite extensive, and not that many people read them, but they did represent a sort of coalitional marker that did constrain people to some extent, and in fact, presidents did try to adhere to them, according to people who've studied it, most of the time. And now you nominate the president, the candidate decides what the platform is, or if there's going to be one.
Or even one, yes.
Right. There's going to be one. What it says, he can throw out commitments that have been longstanding by the party. And it has become very personalistic. And I think that does kind of tie in with the whole potential for demagoguery as well, that kind of personalistic leadership.
I'm not going to try to encapsulate everything that we heard today. That would be foolishness. But I have to say that as I sat through all these conversations today, I did see a golden thread of sorts. And it began with Yuval Levin, who observed that a constitutional republic is a system, and this system requires people to perform their roles. They have to understand the system as a whole and what their roles are within that. And we see that as we went through each panel, this idea kept coming back. It's a huge problem. And I think, going forward, one thing certainly I'm going to be thinking a lot about is this question of how do we expand both public and public officials' understanding of what their system is and what their roles are in it. It's not going to be easy, but it's hard for me to see how we're ever going to reform a system, how we're ever going to make our constitutional governance system work better if we can't at least get some idea of what the whole thing is supposed to be doing and where each of us fit in it.